Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the 7th session of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers in multiple fields hosted by the Center to continue critically important conversations in the fields of American studies and religious studies. I want to just let folks know at the beginning that next month will be our final session for this inaugural year of Religion, and we've had amazing sessions, and I want to thank you all for joining us, for engaging these conversations, and really pushing forward this field as we've discussed and engaged these topics. The first 6 episodes have been dynamic and thought-provoking discussions that have ranged from everything from vaccine protocols and public rituals of the state to last month's religion and climate change. All of these episodes and clips from them are available on the Center's website and our YouTube channel. And I want to thank the scholars who took time out of their schedules last month to provide nuanced and engaging discussions to challenge the fields of religion and American studies around climate change. Thank you, Lisa Sedaris, Peter Tucson, Amanda, and Evan Berry for last month's discussion. I see Amanda's here. Hey, Amanda. Thank you, everyone out there, for joining us today. And we hope you will join us also next month for our final session. Today, our 7th section examines religion and grief. Given the year that we've been through, the multiple types of losses and sadnesses people have struggled with, it is fitting that we consider the roles of religion in all of this. Religion and grief, however, extends beyond the pandemic, and this discussion will explore the ways scholars of religion and American studies are theorizing death, grief, suffering, and the rituals that attend to these moments. We're going to be asking questions like, how can we complicate our analysis and narration of grief? Is grief an adequately compelling and capacious term to address the loss and sadness that we are theorizing in our work and that we're experiencing day to day? And so I am so excited to welcome the scholars and thinkers for today's discussion. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit questions throughout the Q&A feature on Zoom, right? So you use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and if you want to talk to each other, please use the chat feature. This will enable our hosts and our panelists to engage those questions as they facilitate this important conversation. Now I want to get out of your way, so I'm going to introduce the host for today's conversation, and we will move into the broader discussion. First, I want to introduce Laura Levitt, who is a professor of religion, Jewish studies, and gender at Temple University, where she has chaired the religion department and directed both Jewish studies and the gender, sexuality, and women's studies program. Her latest book is The Objects That Remain, that was published in November 2020 from Penn State University Press. And Laura is the editor of NYU Press's North American Religious Series with Tracy Fessenden and David Harrington Watt. And so I want to welcome Laura Levitt to today's discussion. Our additional host is Brian Stiesland, who works here at IUPUI with me. He is a professor and chair of sociology and the director of social science research at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI. His research interests include religion, culture, politics, and civic life in contemporary America. Brian's newly edited book, Situating Spirituality, Context, Practice, and Power, coming out this summer from Oxford University Press, is co-edited with Jamie Konsinkis and Anna Sun. And so now I want to hand this conversation over to Brian and Laura to introduce our 2 other panelists and to begin this very important conversation.
Thank you, Joseph, and welcome everyone. It's nice to see you, as it were. One of the really exciting things about hosting an event like this is you get to do a little bit of pre-seminar email exchange, and I know that we have a lot of ground to cover. So even though I could go on quite extensively about our 2 guest panelists, I would just like to introduce them briefly so we can dive straight into the discussion. Candy Can is an associate professor of religion in the interdisciplinary core at Baylor University. She studies death and dying. And among her numerous publications is a book, second book, I believe, that came out a couple years ago called Dying to Eat, Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Food, Death, and the Afterlife. She also has a handbook of death and dying that came out 2 years ago that looks fascinating. Also with us is Brandon McCormick, who's an associate professor of both Pan-African Studies and Comparative Humanities at University of Louisville. He studies, among other things, Black religion and cultural studies, and the contested relationships between the prophetic tradition in Black religion and the cultural production of the hip hop generation, which I'm looking forward to learning more about, probably in some other context than today. Among his many works are a recently published article, but we are still living in Mafa, commemorating 1619 to 2019 through ritual performances of healing and hope in New Orleans and New York. So welcome to you both. I'm looking very forward to the conversation that's going to unfold over the next hour or so. I wanted to start off with a pretty broad question, which kind of deals very straightforwardly with the topic that we have in store today. What is in your mind, or in the mind of scholars and your conversations partners, what is the relationship between religion and grief? And there are a couple of ways that we can get at that, and you're welcome to take the question in whatever direction you want to. But two ways of thinking about it are, what do we learn about religion through the lens of grief? And another question is, what do we learn about grief through the lens of religion? Those are two different ways that we can kind of start to think about this intersection. So if I could turn it over to Candy. First, do you have any preliminary thoughts to help us set the table?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've really been thinking about is that we're still really uncomfortable talking about death, looking at COVID. And I have to say, a year ago when the COVID pandemic really started in the United States, there were about 85 scholars and death specialists, funeral home workers, thanatologists, tech workers in the death industry. We all got together and put together this handbook on COVID and we were excited because we thought, wow, we're finally going to start having this conversation. And I'm still not really hearing a conversation. So one of the things that I love about religion and the study of religion is that for some reason, religion and the field of religion allows you to talk about death, and it allows you to think about death, to reflect on death. And I go from, the Buddhist perspective, where the Buddha encourages his followers to go to a cemetery and sit among the tombs and the bodies, and to think about death and the ways in which really acknowledging and embracing death can help us to live better. I think about the lamentations that are a key part of religion and so many religious texts. I think about how some religions have fetishized death. We have like the Catholic catacombs and all kinds of, bits and pieces of dead people around the world chopped up. And in Buddhist cultures, you have little fingers that become the foundation and the base of the stupas. And Christian culture, I think Jesus must own like 300 teeth and 400 fingers. And you have all these bits and pieces, right, of different saints and ways in which bodies then become entwined with these sacred spaces and kind of demarcate sacred place. And then other religions ignore death completely. I think here kind of like the Protestant tradition, where the goal is to really focus on the afterlife, right? So the more evangelical Christian traditions, where it's kind of one and done, and now Jesus is not on the cross anymore because the cross symbolizes this resurrection and the disappearance of the body. And so I really love religion because I feel like the conversation has always happened in the field of religion. And it's a place where the conversation surrounding death and grief and mourning and lamentations continues to be embraced, and allows us to really think not just about death and dying well, but also about life and living well.
Thank you. Brandon, can you join us with your reflections?
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah, just thinking about this broad conversation, the broad topic, and I'm sure we'll get into much more specificity, but in terms of we're thinking about death and loss and the kind of emotions and affects that it brings along in terms of grieving and mourning, and the ways in which we as human beings attempt to make sense of that, or to make sense of life after loss or life in the midst of loss, and the ways in which we often don't have adequate frameworks to talk about that, and the ways in which we like to deny death, or to deny or to imagine our own immortality or longevity. And yet when we're faced with death, we look for explanatory systems to help us make sense of them. And religion certainly is one of those places where we turn to get the languages and the cosmologies and the frameworks in which to make meaning out of loss and death and grief and suffering and those experiences. And so religion offers us this meaning-making system to help us to bear up under the burden of loss and grief and death. But it also provides us with the kind of ritual practices of community and care that help to sustain us and to create communities of care and nurture, also within the midst of our grieving and mourning. So that's one way, I think, to think about this relationship at a broad level between the mediation, religion as a mediating factor in terms of how it mediates our experiences with loss and grief and death. But that's the most positive reading of it, right? And I don't know how quickly we jump into the other side of things, but certainly we can think about the ways that religion facilitates loss and death and grief in very real ways, right? And so, certainly for me as one who teaches African-American culture and history, the ways in which religion becomes a facilitator and a justificatory system for the loss of life, or an explanatory system that downplays the significance of certain lives being lost and grieved and the like. And so, or the ways that religion plays a function in creating other forms of loss outside of death, the loss of community and loss of connection and loss of any number of sets of relationships that people are grieving precisely because of the workings of religion in their family, or because of their identities, marginalized in many different ways. And so we think about a multiple set of possibilities that religion plays out, or connections that religion has with loss and grief, that I'm sure that we'll continue to unpack as we have our conversation here together.
Yeah, thank you.
So if I can just pipe in here, I love the way you both kind of set us up to really think in a really capacious way about the possibilities and the limitations of religious discourse and religious practices in relation to loss and grief and mourning. And I take this very seriously. And one of the things I just want to just sort of highlight is something that I've thought about in my own work, which is I love what Brandon was talking about in terms of an explanatory system, which sometimes can be Pollyannish, or kind of smooth away the painful part. But by the same token, there's a way in which even in the most secular aspects of American culture, when we think about death and dying in particular, this is one of the few places where people end up, in religious context, because when they think about funerals, right? And I just think about acts of mourning and the ways in which that brings people back into the sphere of religion. So I think that's one of the things that does help us imagine and have this kind of conversation, because it is the site in American culture where we have permission to do at least some of that kind of work and some of those kinds of rituals. And the second thing I wanted to say is that I think religion also is a discourse that allows us to talk about that which we don't have control over. So even as it provides explanatory stories to kind of maybe mediate some of the pain of loss, it's also a site where there's humility about what we don't know. And that which, the therapeutic and other kinds of discourses can't really capture. So I want to kind of put that out there, and then I want to come back and maybe we'll go back to Candy, but with an answer to this other question. And these are kind of the broadest questions that we wanted to address, because we wanted to make sure that in this last year we really talk about the particular kinds of forms of grief that so many of us have experienced, both collectively and individually. So as a year marked indelibly by grief and loss, I want to just enumerate some of these and ask you all to think about them with us. The grief associated with the loss of loved ones, the trauma associated with racial injustice and police brutality, especially given the violence in Minnesota while this trial is going on. I want us to keep that in mind. I want us to think about the losses of social lives, our daily rhythms, the quotidian daily lives that we've come to take for granted, that we can no longer take for granted. I also want to think about the work-life balances and imbalances that so many are experiencing, and the loss of jobs, among other things. So really the question is, what are your reflections on the grief associated with the past year? I mean, are there things in particular that you want to highlight? And so maybe Candy, if you could get us started, that would be great.
I'll get us started, but I'm sure Brandon will finish us off with like fantastic observations. The one thing that I really noticed is that we're, like I mentioned, we're still super uncomfortable talking about death. And I really kind of was shocked that we knew so little about the 1918 flu pandemic. I mean, I thought about, the past plagues, the other pandemics that we've suffered through as humanity. And so that was kind of where I started. And just thinking about the 1918 flu pandemic, for example, 650,000 American lives were lost. And 25% of all Americans got the flu that year. And it hit people between the ages of 20 and 40 the most. Life expectancy decreased by 12 years. And yet the president at that time, President Wilson, he refused to talk about the pandemic because he felt that talking about the pandemic would take away from the need to focus on the war at the time. So I find it so interesting that I'm seeing people repeat these horrific patterns of being. On top of it, I do think the pandemic has absolutely revealed terrible structural inequities that have been around for a long time that people refuse to see. For example, among African American and non-Hispanic persons, hospitalization rates remain at 2.9% for COVID sufferers and die at twice the rate of whites. Among Latine or Latinx population, we're seeing deaths at 2.3% with 3 times the hospitalization. So I think, just watching the way that healthcare continues to ignore the needs of BIPOC populations and continues, I think the pandemic has helped us to amplify the structural inequities that have been around a long time. Also, I think about people who are not able-bodied. I'm deaf, so the pandemic has offered me unique tools to be able to get through this time because I rely on lip reading and the captions at the bottom of the TV. My poor daughter, she's grown up watching captions, so even though she has perfect hearing, she can't watch a show without it because I've always had them on. But I think that the pandemic has also highlighted the way we think about, talk about, and interact with those people who are not able-bodied, the discourse surrounding this kind of language and the way we talk about them, the way they're treated, what accommodations are actually provided and what accommodations remain to be provided. For me, this has been a very difficult year, but it's also highlighted some of the structural inequities that we've continued to ignore. And I'm hoping that that will change.
Thank you. Brandon?
Appreciate that conversation. I'm struck by Candy returning to this notion that we're so very uncomfortable as a society talking about death and facing it squarely. And so you think about the ways in which the Trump administration handled the pandemic and the unwillingness to take really seriously the loss of life, right? And to deny it and to downplay it, and for reasons perhaps similar and perhaps different than the administration that you're talking about in the previous flu pandemic, but the ways in which that denial of death, as it were, of a serious discussion about it, and the ways in which religion perhaps plays into that, insofar as why white evangelicals are willing to continue to back this narrative, right, and to downplay the ways in which the pandemic is affecting us in ways that have to do in some ways with their religious concerns or beliefs or religious investments in Trump and his administration and his way of describing the current socio-political context of the United States. The rush to get back to normal, the rush to get our schools back open, the rush to get our churches back open, and death be damned, as it were, right? And so this denial of death and the effect that it's having upon the country on the one hand, writ large. But then again, for me, in the specificity of the context, for me, of thinking about African Americans or thinking about Black American communities who have lived especially precarious lives, who have always already been in very close, inextricable proximity to death, right? And so we have perhaps an intensification in this moment of death and deathliness, but it is not something that's out of the norm. And so talking about death, I think, within Black communities, unfortunately, is all too much the norm, because death is ever present. It's a life lived within the context of the specter of death, of not knowing in which in any moment one might be subject to death because one is Black. And this is, I think, for me, thinking about that important article that Claudia Rankine wrote a few years ago, right after the Charleston massacre in South Carolina, where she was talking about the condition of Black life is one of mourning, right? That mourning is this kind of constant thing that's happening because of the precarity of Black life and the disposability of Black life, and the ways in which Black people are always being subject to not only death at the hands of these medical pandemic issues, but also, again, vigilante violence and also state-sponsored violence against Black bodies. And so that one is almost always in a kind of state of perpetual mourning, so that when we see the pandemic coming and we see additional loss of life, it's a heightening of that. And then we see people being murdered in the midst of pandemics. So I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, an essential worker working in the middle of a pandemic, right? And she's killed by the police, and right, and the layers upon layers of deathliness that we're experiencing, and thinking about how we're mourning the individual losses of lives lost to COVID and the lives lost to racial injustice at the same time, among communities who have had all too much death to deal with. And how does one mourn that, right? Christina Sharp, the scholar, says, how does one mourn that which is interminable, right? There's almost a sense that to really begin to mourn, an event has to be over. But Black death and dying is perpetual in such a way that how can one really begin to mourn that?
So Brandon, I really liked how you brought up communities of care earlier. What have you seen in terms of communities of care in COVID? I'm sure that looks different, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, obviously, because we're trying to social distance, and we're trying to keep our space from one another, and so we can't care in the ways that we want. So we can't just hug, we can't just embrace one another, and particularly we can't even show up to the funeral of a loved one. And so as I think Laura said earlier, sometimes death and dying is that space that brings us back into religious community. And yet for so many of us who have had loved ones who have passed away, the respective religious sanctuaries are not open for us to come back into care. And so we've had to cultivate alternative means of care that have had to supplement or help us to make do without the kind of physical contact that we've needed. So the virtual, I mean, that's the real rub. We do so much Zooming, we do so much virtual that we're all zoomed out and we're exhausted by Zoom, and yet we rely upon these platforms to connect and care from one another in ways in the absence of other possibilities. But that notwithstanding, for me, again, thinking back here in Louisville, we saw so many people flocking and flooding into the streets, right? So that protest itself was an act of communal grief, right? An outpouring of emotion and mourning over the loss of life. And it was over compounded loss. It was over Breonna Taylor's life. It was over Ahmaud Arbery's life. It was over George Floyd's life. But it was also over these other lives that we've lost from COVID, from these other factors. And people were one minister who was commenting in response to the ways in which protests were framed, right, as anarchy, as rioting, right? And he said, you were so insistent upon seeing the rioting that you overlooked the gathering of the grieving, right? And so that language, the gathering of the grieving, I think is very, very interesting in the ways that this kind of public gathering in public space, in ways that may be analogous to what Judith Butler talks about, right, in her work on public assemblage and the politics of the streets and precarious lives.
You know, one of the things I found really interesting is the way, you know, you have Philando Castile's death, followed by George Floyd, followed by Dante Wright, all in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And it challenges that narrative of, well, racism's only in the South. Well, you know what? No, racism's everywhere in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because I do think there's a real importance to shifting these narratives that have traditionally existed surrounding things like protest or, you know, Southern racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, what's happening in Minnesota is just, I mean, it's you know, it's almost, it's too much to bear for a community, right? I mean, it's just wave after wave after wave after wave of continued, it's deja vu, it's the repetition of these kinds of killings and murdering. During the summer, as we kind of bring this back to religion in a way, one of the most profound and disturbing displays that I remember seeing on social media was a young immigrant Muslim woman out protesting in her hijab, and she was having an encounter with the police, and they were going back and forth, and she was, I mean, just the emotional intensity with which she was engaging him, but always keep calling him sir. Sir, why are you here, sir? Why are you here, sir? You know, your very presence is re-traumatizing us. And people who were telling her, go home, leave. And she's saying to them, listen, I'm not going anywhere. I've lost 3 brothers, right? And the same young woman said, I've lost 3 brothers to the same type of state-sponsored violence. I have to be here. Right, I have to be in this space, in these streets. Right, my faith compels me. My moral witness compels me. But also, I hear that also in saying that there's something about my grieving process, about my mourning process, about the possibility of healing. Right, that's at stake in my showing up here and bearing witness to this avalanche of loss that continues to happen. In a place like Minneapolis.
It's just so very powerful to listen to both of you speak so eloquently about the urgency of so much of what we are experiencing collectively, and with specific horror in relation to vulnerable communities, the kind of structural inequities that mark so many lives and deaths that we really haven't been able to account for. And as I was thinking about Minnesota, I kept thinking, you know, I haven't been able to watch the trial. I have a lot of problems with the juridical as an answer to violence, because I find it so profoundly violent in and of itself. And I do think that the protests and there's so many other ways in which we can do justice to the lives that were lost. And it's just so hard because it's not George Floyd's case, it's the state's case, and it's about what the state needs. And And so it's very, very hard, because I also think there's just so many expectations, of course, that the law is the fix, and it's not the fix. And to have these, to have this other horrible, violent death happen in the midst of this trial, in that place, at this time, is just such a profound repetition of precisely what Brandon was talking about. So I just want to kind of adumbrate and sort of reiterate, how painful and difficult this time has been. I'm going to ask Brian to come back with and ask a different question and maybe shift our gears a little bit, but I just want to thank you both.
Yeah, and the one thing that I want to throw in to reiterate something that Brandon said in our pre 3 o'clock discussion was that in light of the George Floyd shooting and all the atrocities before and after that, he made the observation that the state basically makes Black death ungrievable in some sense, because it maintains white supremacy to do so. And so in reflecting on the so-called protests in the streets, those are protests, but it's also grieving. And it's also bearing witness. And all of those things, especially in a time of social isolation and COVID, all of those things are happening simultaneously. And it's so important to recognize that it is protest, but it's not only protest, it's also publicly allowable grieving. It's also public witness to death. It's all those things wrapped into one. And I'm sure it's experienced like that, but it's often not characterized like that in the broader public media. So I just want to observe that. To take us in a slightly different direction then, 2020, has so many adjectives attached to it, but one of the things that we've all experienced is a lot more isolation than we're accustomed to. And death and grieving historically and typically are processed communally. They're processed through institutions. They're mediated by organizations and collectives. So this is a question for Candy, at least initially, because I know you've been keeping your eye on changes, kind of technological changes in the observation of death and grief, and you've been paying attention to things like virtual ceremonies and rituals and do-it-yourself rituals and ceremonies. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've been observing?
Sure. So on the theoretical side, I want to just address this really quickly before I get into all the fun tech stuff. But on the theoretical side, one of the things that I've been really working on the last few years is educating people about continuing bonds theory, which was created by Class and Silverman. Class had studied in Japan, became familiar with Japanese death rituals, and then decided that it was far healthier to grieve with the intent of keeping the dead in some changed state with us in the world of the living. And he found that that was far more helpful to reaching an integrated grief state. So in other words, healthy grieving, that you kept the dead in your life, but just in a new form. And you can do this in lots of different ways by having these kind of rituals where you might leave a plate at the dinner table for your loved one who's died. You might talk to the dead. A lot of us have done this for a long time. We've just never had an excuse to do it, right? It was something we kept hidden or silent from others. But what I really do want to mention here, kind of my mission, is that unfortunately, grief theory has been heavily influenced by pop psychology and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of grief, which were really stages for dying and not grief. They were misapplied to grief. And unfortunately, people still think that's actually the way you're supposed to grieve. The typical stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's very American to have these kind of stages that one works through, and then one feels like you've gotten an award. It's like closing your circles in your Apple Watch, right? You like, oh, I worked through all the stages, I'm good. But that's not the way grief actually works. And a lot of contemporary grief theory over the last 20 to 30 years has actually demonstrated that those stages are very unhelpful. They can actually impede the grief process, and they can make it really difficult to move forward with a loss. So I want to just note that. But so in light of that, there's tons of cool stuff happening in the technological realm to help people. So you're seeing all kinds of new technologies on smartphones. There's like grief chat groups now that are available where you're connected to someone that lives in your area and you can offer virtual support through your chat on your phone. There's some really cool websites where you can kind of sign up. There's also really cool like technological innovations in terms of now you can hire a death doula, which is kind of like a birth doula, but on the other side. So if you know you're dying, you want to put together a death plan, you want to plan your funeral, you want to basically make things easier for your family, then you hire a death doula who walks you, but also walks your family through this dying process. They help explain what's coming. They help explain what you'll be going through. And then they also help your family grieve afterwards and kind of process all the different choices available. They help keep them from being taken advantage of in a very vulnerable state. And then there's just super cool like death technologies. One of my friends, Michael Hebb, he founded a website called EOL, End of Life. And it has like over 400 death providers now, all in one little marketplace. And they offer like courses and they contract services. And I really love the latest disposal options. So I worked with a company this past year called Returnaba that turns people's cremains into wearable jewelry. So you turn the cremains into carbon, you turn the carbon into a diamond, then you cut and color the diamond, and then you wear them as a piece of jewelry. You can also turn your loved one into a stone. Partingstone.com is one option. Spiritpieces.com offers like really cool glass pieces. You can turn your loved one into a record, into a tattoo, or even a firework. So there's tons of cool things happening in the death and grief realm. And there's lots of really cool innovations in terms of overseas. In China, for example, for Qingming, the holiday where you go and it's a tomb sweeping holiday. So you clean up the grave and you make offerings. Because China's graveyards are publicly owned by the state, they then offer an app to cut down on transportation, to cut down on environmental waste. And that allows you to virtually visit the deceased, leave offerings, make prayers, et cetera, et cetera. And we're seeing lots of cool innovations like this in both China and Japan, Hong Kong and Singapore. Just really neat things happening in the whole death and grief world.
Great. I'd like Brandon to jump in on that if he wants, but I also wanted to cue Laura to maybe jump in too, because I know, Laura, you've been thinking a lot about materiality and its relationship to death and grieving. And a lot of what Candy was describing was very explicitly turning grief and death into materiality. So I just want to throw that.
Well, if I could pop, I'll just pop in for a minute here and just say,
Sure.
So I wrote a lot about, I ended up writing about relics. And so Candy talking about all those little bits and pieces to begin with, and then coming back with talking about the jewelry. And I will say, Candy, we had a wonderful dissertation on rituals about companion animals. And Amy Deffenbach at Temple wrote about, some of the kinds of things that you're describing before the pandemic that were being done in relation to companion animals, including pachydermy for a loved animal, which is very complicated, again, for all those reasons. But I think there's something about in our isolation and in our virtuality, what I really find so powerful is so many of the things that Candy is talking about, has just talked about, are tactile. They're embodied, and I think that again, the need to express and live with grief or loss or trauma. I mean, I write about violence. I mean, how do you live on with that? And we live with these touchstones that are literally sometimes stones that we touch, right? objects, because the materiality of our own bodies, and whether they've been violated or our loved ones have been have died, there's something tactile and physical that we need in order to kind of carry on. And so I write about, tainted objects from violent crimes, and the ways in which they allow us to remember those past and live with the kind of grief that that Brandon was talking about, the ongoing life that's not about a turning away, which of course echoes what Candy's saying about scholars of grief, explaining that this is not a linear process of a set of stages that you go through when you're done with this, but it's about a living on and a carrying on that means that we bring our grief with us, and we need those touchstones to be reminded of what we carry forward. So, I wear rings that, this ring was my mother's, right? I think that a lot of us have these objects that are a part of our daily lives that enable us to remember those we love, those we've lost, and also the experiences that we've had of violation or other forms of trauma and loss. So I'll stop there and go to Brandon.
Oh, I was caught up into the conversation just listening to the fascinating things that you all were talking about in terms of these innovations and the material culture that's been produced from death and in response to death. So I'm not sure that I have something to add to that per se, as much as I was just intrigued by all the things that Candy was saying that were being produced from loved ones' remains. I was intrigued by all of those. I was thrown a little bit by the fireworks. I could imagine being turned into most of those things except a firework. I don't want to explode again, I think after death, but I'm sure that's meaningful to someone. But I was also thinking about your conversation about the ways in which objects or material objects from the scenes of violent crime come are taken on by survivors and invested with new meaning in ways that help those survivors to negotiate those the life after loss. I find that to be really, really interesting as well. So again, those are just the things that I'm hearing and what you're saying that I'd love to hear more about at some point, but not necessarily something that I have to add to.
So maybe Brian, if you want to add to this, if you could maybe talk a little bit about maybe I was thinking about rituals, right, and new rituals, and some of the ways in which maybe some of you have some examples of some of those that you might want to talk about.
I do, but I'm seeing the queue in the Q&A lengthen, and so I would like to try and incorporate some of those questions, if it's okay with you, Laura.
Absolutely.
So these are all, there's some different questions, so I want to maybe frame each one. One is about, I guess, what I could describe as collective grieving. What is our capacity as a nation or as a society to grieve collectively? And I'm just going to read the question and pick out what you will. Do you think it's do you think it's possible to meaningfully integrate death on such a mass scale into our personal or national narratives? How can we approach that as a national project in the face of current differential, presumably like polarized politics? So what is our capacity to collectively grieve? And maybe where is religion or civil religion or different types of religious traditions, how does that enter the picture?
So I can jump in on that. I think of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington Cemetery. But that being said, so in other words, I think we have the capacity to collectively grieve and to grieve as a nation. But that being said, there's people that are left out of that narrative, right? So, I mean, really, we're selectively grieving collectively, which is a completely different thing. Do we have the capacity? I should hope so. Will it happen? Probably not. We're just too fractured at this point that, I mean, yeah, I don't see it happening. But I do think, I think of the Kusuni Shinto Shrine in Japan. I think of Arlington Cemetery and the Unknown Soldier. I mean, there are like examples in which it's possible, but does it include everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I worked on Holocaust memory, and so that is a really a collective form of grieving. And I think about how places like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the new African American History Museum and the Museum for the Native Americans in Washington are alternative sites to the military in terms of how we think about loss and grief as a collective. And I do feel like that those kinds of museums become sites where I think different law. I wrote about this in my last book on American Jewish loss after the Holocaust, to say that, you know, people go to places like the Holocaust Museum, or I would say the Museum of African American History in Washington, and we bring our own ghosts to those places, those of us who come from very different sites. And I do think that there is a possibility of a kind of interaction in terms of the ways in which different forms of grief and different kinds of losses do touch each other and can, you know, adumbrate and sort of illuminate each other. And that's not about conflating them or making them one and the same thing, but to be in those sites. And I think when I went to the African American Museum for the first time, I was just so moved by what it meant to be there and to be among people, the sort of collective experience of going through the museum with lots of different kinds of Americans, and the kind of the profound engagement with trauma and loss and in the African American experience was incredibly moving. And I think that's a site. I worry about, quote, national, because of course, Candy's absolutely right to go to the military, and I just don't want to do the military. I just really worry. I mean, we saw this after 9/11, the kind of how grief quickly turns into a kind of battleground, right? And I really want to resist that form of collective engagement as a kind of militarizing of grief. And so I want to be really careful about that. And of course, politicization. So I think, again, those museum sites don't have the same kind of valence as the military and Arlington. And I do think that they can be very meaningful, but partial, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, I love this question from Phyllis. Can you see it, Brandon? Because it ties in with your work on Black Joy.
I was going to save this until the end so we could end on a bit of an up note, but let's go ahead and ask it now. So,
well, maybe I don't know, because I in some ways I wanted to touch on what you were saying before, and
sure,
then
go ahead.
I don't know, maybe it connects, but then that may make for a really long answer. So first of all, in terms of the collective capacity to grieve, goes back to Brian, what you were saying earlier in our conversation about that will require really working against the state's role in making certain lives ungrievable, right? In order to maintain injustice and current systems of the status quo, and particularly anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And so that if you create a context in which Black lives become ungrievable, right? Then just think about the emergence of Black Lives Matter itself as a mantra. Right, the founders of that movement, that hashtag movement, are writing that is really initially an expression of grief, right? As news of Trayvon Martin breaks, it is a social media response to say, I'm heartbroken by this, I'm grieved by this. Our lives matter, my lives matter, you know, Black lives matter. That's an articulation of grief, right? And yet the immediate pushback, no, all lives matter. Right, immediately erases what Black Lives Matters is doing as grief work, right? To say that Black life is ungrievable. Now we have to think about all lives. And because, so there's a question of what lives are invested with worth and value that are significant enough to mourn, to grieve, right? And if there are not lives that are respectable, or they're not seen as, being aligned with, civil, being civilized, or however you want to think about this, a kind of middle class respectability, then they're ungrievable. And we can think about that in terms of queer lives. We can think about that in terms of Muslim lives. We can think about that in terms of lives at the border, among immigrant lives, right? So certain people who die are just simply expendable, and we cannot grieve them, or we cannot collectively grieve them, because we can't agree that their lives were inherently valuable in the first place. And so religion certainly has some role to play, right, in the possibility of reinvesting lives with meaning and value, at its best. In the same way, so you mentioned the tomb of the unknown soldier. I think about the tomb of the unknown slave that's in New Orleans, right? Now here's maybe a segue. So the tomb of the unknown slave sits outside of a Catholic church there in New Orleans, that was erected precisely because it understands that so many enslaved Africans were murdered and buried unceremoniously, and were treated as ungrievable. And so it was a moment there to say that we have countless lives that were never properly mourned or grieved collectively, even though they might have been by their immediate families. And so this is a monument, or an erection of a monument that allows us to grieve. Now, what happens in New Orleans? And you mentioned, Brian, earlier, the most recent article that I published on the Ma'afa commemoration that happens, which is, Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word for great tragedy, which is a ritual ceremony that has arisen over the last 20 years or so, that commemorates the lives lost in the transatlantic slave trade and what Saidiya Hartman will call the afterlives of slavery, right? The ongoing loss within the African diaspora. But in places like New Orleans, every year on 4th of July weekend, there is a gathering of people, primarily of African descent, but people across racial and ethnic lines gather there in Congo Square, right? We don't have time to talk about the significance of that as a sacred site, important to Indigenous and African American folks. But they start there with this kind of very formal ritual and make a procession throughout the French Quarter and stop at various sites that were important during the era of slavery. One of those sites that they stop at is the tomb of the unknown slave. And sometimes the Mardi Gras Indians will have a performance, and people will sing and people will mourn. And then they make the procession all the way to the river, to the Mississippi River, and people collectively mourn then the past and present loss of life. It's understood as a ritual of remembrance and of healing. But only in a place like New Orleans can that really come alive, right, in a particular kind of way, given that tradition of the second line, that tradition of the jazz funeral, that tradition of walking with a grieving family to the burial site, right, in mourning and grieving. And then on the way back, making sure that you insist upon, now, however one is feeling emotionally, that you insist upon a kind of intentionality of celebration of a life, that we will create, if we were insistent about mourning and grief on the way to the burial site, on the way back, we will insist upon joy. We will insist upon music. We will insist upon dancing. We will insist upon creating an affect of joy, of celebration of life, to say that life goes on. So the New Orleans poet Kalamu Yasalam talks about, in the midst of post-Katrina, he talks about, damn death, life goes on. We go on, we dance because life is eternal. We continue to go on, right? This is the kind of New Orleans, Afro-diasporic New Orleans spirit of insisting upon these ritual practices of joy in the midst of mourning, in the midst of death, as a way of resisting, right, the effects of the kind of perpetual death that we see. So yes, this is insistence on rituals of creating joy are very important, and you can trace those to those traditions like the jazz funeral, the second line, and to these other rituals that are pushing back on or helping to heal the mourning and the grief.
That's beautiful. Candy.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm not following that up. That was perfect.
So we have only a couple minutes left, and unfortunately there's a lot more to talk about than we're going to have time for, but I wondered if I could close us out maybe on a practical note. A number of the questions in the Q&A basically ask, how can we grieve better? One of the comments talks about the kind of compiled grief that we've all accumulated over the course of the last year. In a sentence or two, and maybe aside from everyone having a big, trumpet-clad parade, what are some practical things that you might be able to say about, and things that you've learned about grieving better or grieving differently, or taking advantage of the kind of communities of care that have come up already in the conversation?
So one of the things I like that Brandon really brings up is just kinetic mourning with our bodies and actively mourning. And I think that is one of the best things that we can do to help us grieve, particularly now when we can't come together. It doesn't have to be virtual. We had a student die by suicide 2 weeks ago, and one of our teachers led a socially distanced hike and walking through all of his favorite areas in our town. It can also be, like I said, leaving a place at the dinner table. It can be lighting a candle every week. Another friend of mine had a cousin die in the very middle, at the worst time of the pandemic, and they did a drive-by funeral where everyone flashed their lights, but they drove by, and you could see each family coming and showing their care. So I think embodied practices in which we collectively mourn together are really important, but we can also do these things on our own. We can do individual practices. We can light a candle every morning. We can light a candle every night. We can, I think one of the most beautiful things from Dia de los Muertos is the setting up of an altar. You can simply place a picture of your loved one somewhere in the house and make offerings, light a candle, light some incense, play their favorite music, give them a beer on Friday night. I mean, these are embodied practices that I think really help us because we hold grief in our bodies. And I think by actually practicing kinetic grief, it helps us to move through to a better place. Not necessarily get better, but to move through to a better place.
Absolutely. And I think we can also pick up on, traditions and, in our various religious traditions and reimagine them. So I have a good friend who lost her father in October and had to go to Chicago, and she's been dealing with his estate, and she's been living in this apartment, his apartment, a lot, and since he died, she started taking pictures at sunrise, and she sends them out to different groups of friends and family every day, except for on Shabbat and on Jewish holidays. She's an observant Jew. And it's now over, it's over 100 and some odd days. And I get this whole catch of images every day. And when my mother died 11 years ago, I was trying to figure out my own grief, and I started taking, before people made selfies, I did this, and I ended up making a film that combined all of those images for a year. And my friend Susan, the same woman, told me at that time that I was doing a kind of Kaddish for my mother. And she's doing this other kind of Kaddish for her father in the midst of this moment. And I get those, I get those emails. Usually it can be 2, 3, 4 different sets of them. And I now know what the sun looks like as it comes up over Chicago in a way I'd never seen before. And I think it's really it's been very, very moving to me to have that and to be able to be connected to her. And she gets to be connected to all of us in that way. And it's not quite as embodied as what you're talking about, but it is a kind of embodiment. And I really appreciate that. And I just so appreciate all of you for the thoughtfulness, Brandon, the beautiful way in which you describe this. We really needed to end, as Brian said, on your gorgeous note about that ritual in New Orleans. So I just want to thank you all.
Thank you.
And I think we have to say goodbye. Is that right?
I think we do. I wanted to remind people that we have one more event in this series coming up on May 20th, an important one that a lot of us in the center have been talking about recently, teaching religion and teaching in and beyond the classroom. So we hope in about a month, again on a Thursday, again at 3 o'clock, you can join us for that. There is a survey that I think all of you will get if you have reflections. Please don't beat us up in the survey about not getting to all the awesome questions with answers. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic, and thank you very much for joining us. And thanks to our panelists. It's been a terrific conversation. Greatly appreciated.